Welcome to the Big Four Accounting Firms podcast, brought to you by big4accountingfirms.com. We have a great show today, but before we get to that, I wanted to remind you of a few things. We have 2 great books on Amazon that will help you get the Big Four job that you deserve, and I've included links to those books in the show notes. Additionally, I wanted to remind everyone to make sure that they subscribe to this podcast to stay up to date on the latest Big Four news and career tips. Also, make sure to share the show with a friend if you get a chance. Lastly, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. I'll include links to all our social media in the show notes. Thanks and enjoy the show. Since PwC just reported their revenues, I wanted to go over the revenue of all Big Four accounting firms that have reported to date and their rankings. First up, let's go over which accounting firms have reported as of today. And the accounting firms that have reported to date are Deloitte, E&Y, and PwC. KPMG has not reported yet and will not report until later this year, as their fiscal year end just ended on September 30th, 2017. But that doesn't mean we can't do a quick rundown of where the accounting firms rank. Okay, let's go over Ernst & Young first. E&Y reported their revenues on September 5th, 2017, and they reported revenues of $31.4 billion when they released their revenues. Next up is PwC. PwC reported revenues of $37.7 billion. Lastly, we have Deloitte, who reported $38.8 billion of revenue. And as you can tell, the Big Four that have reported to date have all had revenues in excess of $30 billion, which is a huge number for them. E&Y barely got over the $30 billion mark this year with their revenue release. They were not above $30 billion in 2016, but they did do it in 2017. And we do not believe that KPMG will surpass $30 billion in revenues in 2017. But that's still yet to be seen. And if you paid close attention to the revenue numbers we just spoke about, you can tell that Deloitte is the largest accounting firm in the world in terms of revenue. Next up was PwC with $37.7 billion of revenue, and E&Y came in third, $31.4 billion. We also believe that KPMG will be the 4th largest accounting firm in the world once they report. That means they're the 4th out of the Big Four accounting firms. Now let's go over which firm is the largest by line of practice. And by line of practice, I mean audit, tax, advisory. First, let's go over which firm has the largest audit practice. And we're going to determine this by revenues. First, let's go over E&Y. E&Y had revenues of $11.6 billion from their audit practice. And next up was PwC with revenues of $16 billion from their audit practice. And lastly is Deloitte. Their revenues were $9 billion from their audit practice. As you can tell, PwC has a huge audit practice with $16 billion of revenue. And E&Y has the 2nd largest audit practice, with Deloitte coming in at 3rd. And one reason Deloitte might be lagging behind is because they don't want their audit practice to interfere with their consulting practice. Because if you audit a client, then you typically cannot provide consulting services because of independence issues. Next up, let's talk about who has the largest tax practice in terms of revenue. First, let's talk about E&Y. E&Y had revenues of $8.2 billion from their tax practice. PwC came up next with $9.4 billion from their tax practice, and Deloitte had tax revenues of about $7 billion. So PwC has the largest tax practice with $9.4 billion. And this will only get bigger in the future with their acquisition of GE's tax department. E&Y is close behind them, though, at 2nd, and Deloitte comes in last with $7 billion in revenue. And KPMG will likely be behind all of them once they report. Now, lastly, let's go over who has the largest advisory practice in terms of revenue. When you combine Ernst & Young's transaction advisory services practice and their advisory practice, they had revenues of $11.6 billion in 2017 from their advisory practice. Now, PwC's advisory practice earned $12.3 billion from advisory. And lastly is Deloitte. And if you combine Deloitte's advisory and consulting practices, their advisory services total $22 billion in revenue. So Deloitte is far and away the biggest consulting provider out of the Big Four. Now, why is this? As you might remember, Deloitte was the only Big Four firm to keep their consulting practice after the Enron scandal. All the other Big Four sold off their consulting practice, so they had to restart them from scratch. This is the reason that Deloitte has such a robust advisory practice when you compare them to the other Big Four. And now that we've gone over who has the most revenue and also who has the largest individual practices by line of service, let's turn to who has the most people. Now, PwC announced that they had 236,235 employees at the end of 2017, while E&Y announced that they had 247,570, and with Deloitte coming in at 263,900. This means that Deloitte is the largest accounting firm in the world in terms of people. E&Y is the second largest, and PwC is the third. What this also means is that PwC is the most efficient in terms of revenue by employee. In conclusion, Deloitte is the largest accounting firm in the world by revenue, and they accomplish this by growing their advisory practice, and it appears that the other Big Four are also trying to turn towards advisory and consulting to grow their practices. And the Big Four accounting firms are getting closer and closer to 300,000 employees per firm and $40 billion of revenue per firm. But right now, they're just getting above 250,000 and over $30 billion in revenue. Now, if PwC is able to grow their advisory practice quicker, they can soon surpass Deloitte because they already have a robust tax and audit practice. So if they start building up their advisory practice and catch up to Deloitte, then they can surpass Deloitte because their tax and audit practices are already greater than Deloitte's. And for PwC, it's just a matter of them steering clear of independence issues with their audit practice. So make sure to keep an eye open for that, for the revenue of the Big Four and where that revenue is coming from, because it's going to dictate where they're going in the future. So that's all we have for today. To stay up to date on all the Big Four news, make sure to subscribe to this podcast. And we are a growing podcast and a growing business. And we would appreciate your help in growing. So if you could share this podcast with a friend and give us a good review on iTunes, we'd really appreciate that, as it would help us grow and provide you with the best Big Four content and career tips possible. Thanks again and have a great day.